Well, you see. 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 I tried to make it on my own. Well, you see. Well, you see. Well, you see. Well, you see. Well, you see.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to talk to you guys about the 1960s psychedelic guru and who was Dr. Timothy Leary. So today we're going to be discussing, it should be a pretty fun stream. Again, I got multiple videos lined up for us to check out as we move through basically the timeline of the life of Timothy Leary, Dr. Timothy Leary. Again, as some of you guys know, a compromised individual working for the CIA, and we're going to be talking about his involvement with the Central Intelligence Agency and actually talking about, well, you got to work for somebody. You know, you're going to work for the Yankees or the Dodgers. And talking about how the CIA came up with, I have a quote here, about 80% of some of his ideas, and how they very much were interested in turning on the counterculture and turning on America in different ways. But again, though we're going to begin with getting into some of the CIA stuff, we're not going to stay there the whole stream. I actually want to talk about his life. I mean, most people aren't aware about what was going on. You know, 1947, he becomes PhD student, and he's over in Berkeley getting his PhD in clinical psychology. We'll be talking about the suicide of his first wife. Did he contribute to the killing and the death, the suicide of his first wife? We're going to be talking about that. I've kind of broken up today's stream in time sections between 1947 to 1960. 1960 is where we get the very famous psilocybin Harvard experiment. This is where he's working in tandem with somebody named Richard Alpert, who later becomes Ram Dass after a series of psychedelic experiences and homosexual experiences with his guru over in India, and comes back and is now Ram Dass. So I have it broken up between 1947 to 1960, and then we'll be getting in from 1960 to 1972, and then really from 1976, when he's actually released from prison, to his death. And he ends up dying of pancreatic cancer. And many of the ideas Timothy Leary's noted for putting forth, such as, especially when he got out of prison in 1976, he was a big advocate for transhumanism. And so I'm sure you guys already know where I'd be going with that in regards to the dystopian, Orwellian technocratic society that we live in, and how many of his ideas, again, Timothy Leary was a catalyst to much of what we as Orthodox Christians, we as traditional Christians are now in opposition to in regards to society. When we, interestingly, again, this is a half of a video, so if you want to catch the second half of today's video, you actually have to go over to the website and become a website member. That is up over for website members, in which I review this very, very interesting interview between William F. Buckley, sort of the face of contemporary American conservatism, often considered the sort of founder of contemporary American conservatism, William F. Buckley, and this 40-some minute interview he did on his show called The Firing Line, which was a very popular show during the 60s and 70s. And he has Timothy Leary on to talk about what's going on with the LSD and his status as, again, this sort of psychedelic LSD guru, trying to get the kids to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And that is a very insightful interview. One, it shows you how far we've fallen in regards to contemporary American society, and even the quality of conversation much higher than you'd see on anything like cable or public television, anything like that. But again, that interview and my commentary over it as we move through it, that is up over at the website at davidpatrickcarey.com/register for those who might be interested. So if you would be interested in becoming a website member to access, again, this exclusive content, the second half to today's stream, you can do so with the link provided here in the chat. And so in that stream, one of the really insightful things is how Timothy Leary keeps referring to himself as more conservative than William F. Buckley, because he wants to escape the liberal disaster of American society, and how he and his contemporaries at Millbrook want to escape into the countryside and live more traditional lives. Very similar to things that we talk about here on this YouTube channel, or generally speaking in the conservative Christian networks, about getting a homestead or becoming more self-reliant, more self-sustainable, all these different things. Yet at the same time, with all this rhetoric, now looking back, in the 21st century, the effects Timothy Leary and the psychedelics and the transhumanism and the feminized understandings of the goddess, the divine goddess, right? Or the self-worship, the idea, again, we see this with Alan Watts, we see this with many of the 1960s countercultural figures that get swept up in the psychedelics, where, again, they are God. And in fact, we're going to be playing clips of Timothy Leary talking about these ideas and putting these ideas forth. And he is a major catalyst to actually what we are trying to fight against now as traditional Christians. So I don't know. That is just a really insightful, again, interview. If you want to see that, that is over at the website. But one of the things I want to get into today as well is the whole Millbrook status within Timothy Leary's kind of trajectory. This isn't as talked about, I think, as much in some of the online stuff, is his stay in upstate New York. That Peggy Hitchcock, one of the heirs of Andrew Mellon, actually, again, one of the wealthier families in America at the time in the 1960s, that they owned this, I think it was like 200-acre property in upstate New York, and they basically gave it to Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner, three of the psychologists that end up leaving Harvard. And that's where they continue much of their research during the 1964 to 1967 period. And so we're going to be talking about that, and then we'll be talking about the movement, his transition over to the West Coast, over to California, where Timothy Leary then again really takes the sort of mantle as the psychedelic guru, and eventually he gets arrested, and then he escapes prison, and then he goes on the run and is smuggled out of the country by the Weathermen Underground. It's a sort of a countercultural, anti-American group that was founded somewhere, I believe, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But they helped smuggle Timothy Leary and wife Rosemary out of the country in 1971, 1972. Again, we'll follow the timeline I've already set out here for today's stream. And they end up going to Algeria with the Black Panthers and living under the auspices of Eldridge Cleaver. For those of you who don't know, he's sort of the leader of the Black Panther movement, until they kick Timothy Leary and his wife out of Algeria. And then they basically are on the run and around an international fugitive, if you will, for 18 months until he's finally arrested in Afghanistan. And when he's arrested in Afghanistan, that's where he then is going to spend the next, I think it's 5 years in prison. But he gives up a lot of names. He, again, had already previously established a sort of working relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. So a lot of stuff to get into today. It should be, again, a lot of fun. So first, just to take care of some quick housekeeping. Again, if you guys would be interested in setting up a one-on-one session to talk about theology, philosophy, magic, religion, world religions, fitness, whatever it is you'd be interested in talking about, you can do that with the link that I just posted below. Also, again, this is the first half. The second half has already been recorded and posted over at the website. If you'd like to see the second half of today's stream regarding Timothy Leary and who he was, you can become a website member using the link posted there. And of course, we have a bunch of exclusive content, my speech at the Trad Forum, the second half of some of the previous streams as well. So lots of good stuff. So, okay, let's get into today's topic. I think the first thing that I want to do is, again, set the sort of framework for today's conversation by looking at how Timothy Leary had a sort of working relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. And so we're going to read this article real quick to set the framework, okay? And so there's this article that I found, is the CIA planned the drugging of America. And then it's about Timothy Leary. This was written in February of 2020. And we're going to sort of read through this real quick to set the framework for what we're going to be looking at in regards to Timothy Leary. So the United States Central Intelligence Agency has been accused of drug trafficking multiple times in history, from Gary Webb to Peter Dale Scott to Larry Collins. Yes, of course. I would like to focus this on another key piece to their promotion of the drug revolution in the 1950s and 1960s, Timothy Leary. And so in the 1950s, by the way, you get the whole beatnik culture. So William Burroughs, who... One of the things that I feel like this might be a whole nother stream in and of itself is to talk about the homoeroticism and the homosexuality that's tied to much of the psychedelics. So again, William Burroughs engaged in some of that activity. He's noted for going down to the Amazon, and one of the first partakers to write about ayahuasca use and partaking in ayahuasca. So again, Allen Ginsberg, Richard Alpert, who becomes Ram Dass. Again, there's just this, with regard to the sexual liberation and the psychedelics, there's this continual strain of homosexuality. But again, that may be another stream in and of itself. So Timothy Leary was a psychologist and became a lead figure in the advocacy for the counterculture. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see it. Now, I'll try to step over here. Okay, there. Was a psychologist and became a lead figure in the advocacy for the counterculture of psychedelics and drugs. But as many know, the powers at be play both sides of the coin. So true. In 1954, the CIA had a program called Operation Midnight Climax, an operation that paid prostitutes in San Francisco and New York to dose men with LSD so they could be lured to a CIA safe house where the unconsenting victims would be monitored for the effects of the drugs. Eventually, this project expanded to dosing people in bars, restaurants, and beaches, and these illegal acts happened from 1954 to 1965. More well-known is Project MKUltra, which I'm sure most of you guys have heard of. Again, I would recommend checking out Jay Dyer's stuff in regards to MKUltra, in regards to much of the music scene, actually, in Laurel Canyon and what was going on in the 1960s, and how major global players, the Central Intelligence Agency, various intelligence agencies, all played a role in much of what we see as, or what people think was, an organic counterculture. Now, there may have been organic sentiments against the Vietnam War, because that also plays in the backdrop of much of today's conversation, is that the Vietnam War was going on in America, and we know that that was a sham, and we know that that was just another way to sell weapons, use weapons, make money, just like we see with Iraq and all the contemporary wars we're in now. But anyways, I digress. More well known as Project MKUltra, in which the CIA used drugs like LSD for attempts at mind control. During this period, the CIA interest in LSD funded research. Timothy Leary received 8 government grants from 1953 to 1958, most coming from the National Institute of Mental Health, which is now notoriously known for being a CIA front for the MKUltra program. Now, for this one section, according to all the research that I'm aware of, Timothy Leary didn't take psychedelics until 1959. Now, during this early in these the 50s period, again, we're going to go through some of his timeline. He was a prominent psychologist over at the University of California, Berkeley, and so I know that he wrote an important book actually on the interpersonal diagnosis of personality, and he had sort of a reputation, a strong reputation as a clinical psychologist for some of the work that he did in regards to personality construction and even sort of relationships and stuff like that, which is going to plague much of his life, as we'll find out here later. But so I'm not too positive of his association with any sort of MKUltra or the Operation Midnight Climax during the 53-58 period, but again, I wouldn't put it past anybody. So Leary even acknowledged in his own words, quote, "The LSD movement was started by the CIA. I wouldn't be here now without the foresight of the CIA scientist. It was no accident. It was all planned and scripted by Central Intelligence, and I'm all in favor of Central Intelligence," unquote. And of course, the disillusioned youth of the 1960s would welcome him with open arms as he pushed for drugs to be an integral part of changing, quote, "the spiritual development and psychological growth of Americans." And that was the other thing. Again, if you check out with the members-only content in regards to the interview with William F. Buckley, he brings up that during the peak, again, 1967, the summer of 1967 is the summer of love. And so 67, 68, 69, these are really considered the peak periods of the 1960s counterculture. You get the Woodstock, the summer of 69. So Haight-Ashbury, the San Francisco, all the flower power, that's peaks in 1967. Now, in 1964, all these recreational drugs become illegal federally. And so before 1964, marijuana, various psychedelic mushrooms or magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, even DMT, these types of things were legal, and you could actually buy them at head shops, most notably in the Bay Area, that you could go and you could buy these things from a store. Now, again, as Timothy Leary gets fired from his research with Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner in 1963, there grows a sort of popularity and aura around LSD in which they are made Schedule I drugs, illegal drugs, in 1964. So just, again, the timeline for me is important. That's how I think about things, is the historical timeline. So we'll be constantly referring back to dates in this timeline. Even more concerning is Leary idolized and believed he was carrying on the work of famous occultist Aleister Crowley. And this was a key point I wanted to bring up again to get today's discussion started, because we're going to see an immense form of hedonism with Dr. Timothy Leary. And the rampant sexual practices. Again, we'll even highlight how his first wife, who eventually commits suicide, they were engaging in as swingers in the Berkeley area, which wasn't uncommon amongst the intelligentsia over at UCB University of California, Berkeley, that occurring to other psychologists, this was something that many of the academics would engage in, that they would wife swap with fellow academics. And so the hedonism that plagues much of Leary's life, you could see certainly exacerbated by the adoption of some of the ideology of Aleister Crowley, again, the founder of Thelema, and Thelema, as it says here, the highest of the law is to do what thou wills. So he is on video saying, quote, "I have been an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think I am carrying on much of the work he started over 100 years ago. I think even the 60's themselves, Crowley said he was in favor of finding your own self and, quote, do what thou wilt, unquote, shall be the whole of the law." That is the whole of the law in Thelema. For those unfamiliar with Crowley, he spoke of animal and human sacrifice. Quote, "For the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. But the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious. And for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is best." That's a quote out of his book, Magic in Theory and Practice by Aleister Crowley. Now, if you talk to a Thelemite, they would probably, me reading this, they'd probably be laughing and chuckling and saying, "Oh my gosh, you Christians, you don't know when he's joking. You don't understand the nuance of Crowley and the Book of Lies and Magic in Theory and Practice." He has all these. Aleister Crowley has multiple books, and many of the practitioners, many of the supporters of Crowleyan magic claim that you have to really know what he's talking about. Like, so if I read this quote, they would say, "Oh my gosh, you guys are so ignorant. You think he really means that?" Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, again, even within the Crowleyites, they don't know what was legitimate, what was sort of ways to rile people up. I mean, it's hard to tell. So what we do know is Aleister Crowley loved to engage in sex magic. He was noted for having men sodomize him. He believed that would give him sort of magical power. Again, Aleister Crowley was all about drugs. He's actually a key figure in my dissertation in tying what I call psychedelic esotericism or psychedelic spirituality to the Western esoteric traditions, the history of Western magic. That Aleister Crowley is really this bridge figure between what you'd see with the Freemasonry, the high-level Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the very secret societies, the Knights Templar, the Hermetic Golden Dawn, and then into what we would see more cultural movements like the counterculture, the psychedelic movement, and the historical trajectory all the way back to alchemy, all the way back to ancient, Hermeticism and stuff like this. So Aleister Crowley is a very important figure, and Timothy Leary was certainly an admirer of him. That's no question. So this is really interesting that he has inside this article is that in 1975, again, this is when Timothy Leary he's been in prison for multiple years at this point. That in 1970, he gets arrested and he's sentenced to prison for 10 years. And it's because he gets pulled over and there's 2 joints in his ashtray, I believe, and he escapes. So again, I'll detail more of this, but eventually he escapes prison. He gets smuggled out of the United States, and he's an international fugitive on the run until he's captured in 72. He's brought back to America and in prison, and in 75, so he's still in prison here, and we see this very interesting article or excerpt from a personal letter that's written to Timothy Leary, from Timothy Leary to dear Mr. Donahue, I'm not sure, United States Attorney of the Southern District of Texas, Houston, Texas. Okay, and what's it say? That Dr. Leary and his attorney, which his name is blocked out, have requested that the facts of his cooperation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, be furnished. These facts are as follows. In May of 1975, Dr. Leary voluntarily agreed to cooperate with a multi-agency task force, including representatives from the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, meaning the DEA, the Department of State, California Department of Justice, and California Bureau of Prisons. In initial taped interviews, Dr. Leary provided extensive information concerning several state and federal violations. The transcript of these interviews totals over 400 typewritten pages. After successfully corroborating Dr. Leary's initial information, he was interviewed by the FBI over a 3-week period at a secure location in California. During this period, he consented to being transported to several other locations in California to identify, quote, safe houses, unquote. Also, Dr. Leary provided invaluable help to interviewing agents by assisting them in retrieving and evaluating voluminous documentary evidence available in the Leary archives. In mid-1975, Dr. Leary was again interviewed by the FBI special agents with representatives of the Department of Justice and the Office of the United States Attorney, San Francisco, present in preparation for his grand jury testimony, which was recently presented at a federal grand jury in San Francisco from May 1974 to the present. And this just says Dr. Leary, and then that's where it ends. So we see that while in prison, and he admits to this, he actually, if you listen to some documentaries with the ex-wife, I believe this was his fourth wife, Rosemary was his fourth wife, that she's the one that went on the run with him. She helped, she was part of the escape. She clearly loved Timothy Leary, and she was an international fugitive as well. When they got back, he eventually wrote a letter to her telling her he kind of scripted out what the narrative is that he was telling authorities or was going to use in court, and was asking her to also corroborate it and identify various names and partners that had helped in much of the workings that he was involved in. And she felt so uncomfortable with what he asked her to do, or the information he asked her to convey, that she was on the run, and she went underground from 1976 basically, or this would have been 1970, I don't know, 1973 probably around, that she went underground until 1995. Nobody knew what happened to her. She literally changed her name. It wasn't until Leary basically died that Rosemary came back to the public fore and re-identified herself as who she was. So you can see that she was very terrified of everything that they were involved in and the potential repercussions. Now, the article continues and says, what kind of spiritual development and psychological growth was Timothy Leary attempting to push on the youth of America? Few in America even let it cross their minds that this counterculture was a means of social engineering for the purpose of debasing America's previous culture. But that's exactly what it was. One of the CIA's own MKUltra researchers, Dr. Louis Jolyon West, while citing Aldous Huxley, had this to say on the matter, quote, the role of drugs in the exercise of political control is also coming under increasing discussion. Control can be through prohibition or supply. The total or even partial prohibition of drugs gives the government considerable leverage for other types of control. An example would be the selective application of drug laws permitting immediate search or no-knock entry against selected components of the population, such as members of certain minority groups or political organizations. But a government could also supply drugs to help control a population. This method was foreseen by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, 1932, has the governing element employing drugs selectively to manipulate the governed in various ways. Now, Aldous Huxley was a close friend of Timothy Leary, and he dies in 1963, the same year that JFK dies, the same year that MLK dies, and technically it's actually the same year that C.S. Lewis dies, 1963. I believe it's November 1963 when Aldous Huxley dies, and he died on LSD, actually. So I know that his wife has said that he took a major dose while he died. But Aldous Huxley was certainly an eccentric, and he promoted these psychedelics. He wrote about his mescaline use and the doors of perception. And so what I wanted to say is, if you go to the website and become a member and you watch the second half of today's stream, you'll see that in the interview he has with William F. Buckley, that Timothy Leary literally talks about how he wants to undermine the entirety of American society, and that he wants the psychedelic movement to basically do what this article's highlighting that the CIA was in favor of. That, again, is sort of debasing and undercutting America's previous culture. And that was part of the nuclear family. That was a traditional understanding of Christian morality and how we interact. The formalism. One of the other things, if you watch the interview over at the website, is how everybody's dressed in the audience. The formal language they use when they ask questions to William Buckley or Timothy Leary, the way they're dressed, both men and women, the way they present themselves is so much more formal than when you look at today and people are in sweatpants and they're slobs and the majority of people are overweight. And the informality of society, which can be good in certain ways, it can be bad in other ways. But you notice it because formalism itself is a sort of boundary. It's a form of differentiation and distinction, of which, if you're familiar with Terence McKenna, he's all about how psychedelics dissolve boundaries. And I've talked about this previously, how the boundary dissolution is really the biggest enemy, the biggest aspect of what the current cultural warfare that we're in, that we as Christians are fighting, right? The dissolution of gender boundaries, the dissolution of national boundaries, the dissolution of family boundaries, the dissolution of racial boundaries, I guess now with the I don't know if you guys saw the transracial person, the British dude that got surgery to look like he's Korean. I mean, I don't know. Even now we have the dissolution of sexual boundaries in regards to age of consent. I mean, we all know that we were run by a bunch of satanic pedophiles, but now it's so out in the open. It's it's shocking if you hadn't already known about it for so long. But anyways, carrying on here in the article, the changes in culture brought about were things like pornography, which gained traction in the late 60s. Again, the sexual liberation. Overtly sexual imagery in media, viewing musicians as idols, a rise in feminism, and rampant drug use. All of which, again, I say these are major blows against any sort of traditional worldview, or especially us as Eastern Orthodox Christians, or if you're just a traditional conservative Christian out there. Feminism's an inversion of the foul logocentric pillar, again, that Jacques Derrida was so interested in, the father of deconstructionism, again in the 1960s, that he said we have to undermine the foul logocentric pillar of Christendom if we're going to, again, really move forward with the feminist project, homosexuality. This is why Michel Foucault was such a proponent, again, of the sort of deconstruction of these various values, or really saying all values are cultural constructions outside of power. So the CIA declassified documents on the Monroe Institute's Gateway Experience and Consciousness detail just how in-depth the agency is interested in altered states of consciousness. They want to know how it works in the brain, outlining a, quote, gateway process started by Robert Monroe to sync up both hemispheres of the brain like high levels of meditation and drug use, specifically LSD. When you tap into this, you tap into the endless flow of knowledge and energy to evolve spiritually or ascend. Sounds a lot like the New Age movement to me. Exactly. And I would say, again, the New Age movement is probably a product. I mean, it is. It is a product of the CIA. It is a product of these Central Intelligence Agencies. And then theologically, we can look, again, how it's absolutely in opposition to any sort of Christian worldview. The hedonism, the transgression of boundaries, the feminist ideas, the divine feminine, in a Christian context, the cosmic Christ principle, all this sort of self-worship, which is synonymous with much of illuministic frameworks of spirituality. So Gateway Experience documents. Page 28 details, quote, encourage pursuit of self-knowledge. Be intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent, non-corporeal energy forms, unquote. Maybe Alex Jones has some truth in his Clockwork Elves spiel on the Joe Rogan podcast. Yes, I recognize both are likely controlled opposition in some way. But look at this. This is an excerpt from the document Gateway Experience document. So this is how the Central Intelligence Agencies wanted to use these mind-altering substances to affect people, to change, again, their perception of reality. So right here at letter H, it says, use multi-focus approach to solve problem of distortion in terrestrial information gathering trips. This approach involves the use of 3 individuals in the out-of-body state, one viewing the target object here in time-space, one viewing it at focus 15 as it slips into the immediate past, and one viewing it at focus 21 as it slips from the immediate future. Debrief all 3 and compare data gathered from the 3 points of view. If care is taken to ensure that the 3 all go out of body together in the same environment, their conscious energy systems should resonate in sympathetic oscillation. They can tune in to the same target of different planes with greater effectiveness. So you see, again, deep, serious investigative, research, manipulation of these mind-altering substances. I encourage pursuit of full self-knowledge by all individuals involved in the foregoing experiments to enhance objectivity in out-of-body observation and thinking, to remove personal energy blockages, like to retard rapid progress. Be intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent, non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. Arrange to have groups of people in Focus 12 state unite their altered consciousness to build holographic patterns around sensitive areas to repulse possible unwanted out-of-body presences. Encourage more advanced gateway participants to build holographic patterns or successful attainment and rapid progress for advanced colleagues to assist them in progressing through the gateway system. So you can see, again, these drugs, and again, you've heard me, I've had your mate Tom on the podcast here to talk about our psychedelic experiences. And again, looking back, I just am so thankful to the Lord that I wasn't opened up to some of this demonic activity that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people bring on themselves. And then when they get into these altered states, they absolutely open themselves up to possession, to direct encounters with various demonic entities. I think that the Central Intelligence Agency was aware of this when they're talking about non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. Now, maybe they don't have the same theological framework that we're approaching it from, but certainly they knew more about what was going on than they let on to be. Continuing on in this article, Timothy Leary in his interviews clearly showed he believes in Gnosticism and the Shekinah of viewing God as divine feminine. And I did a whole stream on the theology of the divine feminine, and saying the knowledge set mankind free and that she wanted us to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He also showed disdain for God of the Bible as a God who just wants the world on its knees for him. Yes, and if you look at some of the videos, some of the interviews he did, and you find this a lot with the psychedelic community or with Gnosticism generally speaking, is this overvalorization of Eve as, well, she's the true hero. She ate from the tree of knowledge. It was that mean, bad boogeyman of a God who didn't want Adam and Eve to be fully illuminated, to know good and evil, to be like him, right? And so this misunderstanding of us being gods, of course, in an Eastern Orthodox context, we have the theology of theosis, and in the New Age, it's really just about self-worship and becoming your own deity. And so you see this overvalorization of Eve as the one who actually had the backbone. And so her eating from the tree of knowledge, even though, again, we don't fall until Adam eats from the tree of knowledge, but that's a nuance that's past them most of the time, that Eve is valorated and valorized as the hero of mankind, and she's the first one to take a psychedelic trip. You'll hear Terence McKenna, you'll hear Robert Anton Wilson, you'll hear Timothy Leary use that same rhetoric, that Eve is the first to take the psychedelic trip. He also showed disdain, as I said, for the God of the Bible as a God who just wants the world on its knees for him. Quote, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves, unquote. The spiritual development Leary spoke of for America was one of controlling the public behavior and subverting them to choose immoral and evil things over the traditional culture which had sustained us under the guise of freedom while only being spiritual slavery. I'll end with this from the following, taken from the W.H. Boart of Constantine report, posted in 2009, of another interview with Leary. Quote, "Do you think CIA people were involved in your group in the 60s? I asked. Without hesitating, Leary said, quote, "Of course they were. I would say that 80% of my movements, 80% of the decisions I made were suggested to me by CIA people." Quote, "I like the CIA," he said. Quote, "The game they're playing is better than the FBI, better than the Saigon police, better than Franco's police, better than the Israeli police. They're 1,000 times better than the KGB. So it comes down to, who are you going to work for, the Yankees or the Dodgers?" I told Leary that based on some of the documents I read, it seemed that he could have been just one of many scientists who'd been used without his knowledge by the CIA to conduct their mind control experiments. And Leary said, "I've known this for 10 years. You were witting of it?" I asked in surprise. "Of course," Leary said, leaning back in his chair with confidence. I couldn't believe my ears. The CIA had created the, quote, psychedelic 60s with Timothy Leary's help? "You were wittingly used by the CIA?" I asked again. "During the 60s? You knew you were being used by the CIA?" And see Michael Hoffman's book, For the Significance of the Names, Are You Serious in this? "Wait," Leary said, "when you say CIA, it's like saying the N-word. I knew I was being used by the intelligence agents of this country," unquote. Quote, "What were you doing for them?" I asked. "What the hell were you doing? Did you want to turn the kids on, huh? Or did they want to turn the kids on, huh? Were they trying to make the kids see God and leave the Vietnam War alone?" Unquote. "Walter, are you starting off into nationalism?" Leary said, "trying to put me on the defensive, exhibiting his fatal character flaw, sold on himself as a master psychologist, a master manipulator. I'm asking you, what was the CIA's motive? What were you used for?" I said again. "The CIA recognized what you probably haven't recognized yet, that I'm a very important national asset." "What can I say?" Leary said. That was Leary. He believed his own press releases. And so I only bring all this up to provide, again, the framework for what we're going to be talking about today. And Timothy Leary and much of these ideas in the counterculture itself was run by the Central Intelligence Agencies, was run by and aided by many of the intelligence agencies probably around the world. It wasn't just the FBI or the CIA, I'm sure. And so who was Timothy Leary then? I want to get into a little bit of the nuance of who he was. So, Timothy Leary, he lived from October 22nd, 1920 to May 31st, 1996. He was a clinical psychologist, most noted for his work at Harvard with the psilocybin project. That was during 1960 to 1962. He grew up Irish Catholic, and so his dad was actually a prominent man over at West Point, but he abandoned Tim and his mother when he was about 13 years old. So Tim didn't have his dad after the age of 13. His dad consciously chose to leave his family, and again, he was a prominent man over at West Point, but due to his father's sort of advice or suggestion, Tim ended up actually joining the military academy over at West Point. Now, this was plagued with many unfortunate events, one of which he had a problem with drinking alcohol. And so he was drunk, and once that was caught and he was actually confronted with his drinking problems, he lied about it. And this was a major no-no at West Point because he broke the honor code. And so eventually he was silenced by his fellow cadets. They literally wouldn't allow him to talk to other people. And his mother, there's letters from his mother, literally asking him to please do whatever you have to do. I don't want to tell the women that my son got kicked out of West Point. So she's like pleading for him to be a good son that she can be proud of. He ends up transferring, and in much of his youth, he was a very smart kid. That from anybody's estimation or experience, again, even his colleagues during his PhD studies at the University of Berkeley said that he was often one of the most intelligent people in the room, and so he was a very sharp man. And growing up, he tended to get into a lot of troubles also. He was a bit of a womanizer, and he liked to party, and he liked to drink alcohol. Not a big surprise. So eventually, he was honorably discharged after he resigned, and I think he went to like the University of Alabama and eventually, I think another school, maybe Ohio State, to finish his studies, and that was his undergraduate. So eventually, in 1947, so these dates are important. In 1947, he makes his way to Berkeley, California, a place I'm all too familiar with, and begins his PhD studies at the University of California in clinical psychology. And again, according to all reports, he had a very promising future, that many of the colleagues, many of the other students were impressed by his knowledge and his ability. He was a very charismatic individual. And so gained the reputation as a man that people liked. People liked to be around. He tended to be the life of the party. So in 1947, the same year that he moves to Berkeley to do his PhD studies, his wife, Mary Ann, actually gives birth to his first child. That's Susan. And she's going to come back as a prominent figure when Timothy Leary gets busted at the Mexico line, the Mexican-American line, for having an eighth of an ounce of marijuana in his daughter's underwear. So again, we'll get to that. We will get to that here in a bit. But in 1947 and 1949, Mary Ann, the woman that Timothy Leary's married to while he's doing his doctoral studies at the University of Berkeley, she gives birth to the second child, and that is Jack Leary. So Jack Leary is his second son. In 1950 now, he receives the PhD, so he was able to finish it in about 4 years. He finishes his PhD in clinical psychology. Again, he's hired by the university because they were so impressed with his abilities. So Timothy Leary is then hired in 1950, and he writes this very important book at the time called Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality. And this work was published. Again, it achieved him national notoriety within psychological circles. And this is also why he was honed by Harvard. Harvard actually sought Timothy Leary out to hire him in 1960. And so one of it is part of his work with personality. He had a great he also he does the 8 circuits of consciousness. Timothy Leary, when he gets arrested, again, how he escaped prison was that the personality test that the inmates are forced to take, he actually constructed that exam. And so he knew how the exam worked, so he answered the questions in a way that would show that he was the least likely to escape, the least likely to be violent, and in so doing, they put him in the most minimalist, restricted environment in the prison, and that's how he escaped at night. But again, that's neither here nor there. But the point of this book, this interpersonal diagnosis of personality, that really kind of haunched off some of his colleagues, is that he gave nobody credit. He gave nobody credit, even though many other people helped contribute to this work. Again, it was mostly his stuff, but he began to get a reputation of being a little bit too egocentric, a little bit of a narcissist. Hey guys, please smash that like if you guys just joined. Would greatly appreciate that. Smash that like, please. Get those likes up. So in 1951, his wife, also Mary Ann, begins having these depressive episodes. And so she starts exhibiting some psychological problems. And this is going to play in here in a minute. And so the Learys were big partiers. This is one of the things that they were known for in the Harvard academic or the Berkeley academic circles, is that they would go to parties, they would drink a lot of alcohol, and they would get into wife swapping. And so they were big swingers. And if you watch some of the documentaries, like on how Timothy Leary turned on America, you'll actually find women that were secretaries in the psychology department talking about their experience with Timothy Leary's wife and how she would say, "I have never refused a man." And so his wife was a very sexual woman, and he encouraged a lot of this activity. And so she would sleep with multiple the academics, and he would have many girlfriends and sleep with many of the other wives of the academics. And the sort of rule, the untold rule, was that you are allowed to have girlfriends, but you can't fall in love with any of them. And so, unfortunately, in 1954, that's exactly what Timothy Leary does. He actually falls in love with a woman who will be his second wife. Her name's Dell. And Mary Ann, the woman that he's married to, the mother of his 2 children, again, already having depressive, deeply depressive episodes in her own life, is absolutely distraught that Timothy Leary, again, she's engaging in a lot of this activity, mind you. Again, she's very sexual, and she's sleeping with a lot of men, but she becomes distraught that he falls in love with a new young woman who, I think she's a graduate student or something in the psychology department, and starts paying her quite a bit of attention. And so in 1955, Timothy Leary wakes up on his 35th birthday, and his wife, Mary Ann, leaves a suicide note where she sleeps next to him on the pillows. He reads the suicide note. He sees that she said she's going to, basically said, "Look what you've done to me. I'm now going to kill myself." And what she did was die of carbon monoxide poisoning by leaving the car on, putting a hose in the exhaust, putting it into the car window, turning the car on, and staying there. Now, it was his 35th birthday. Before she killed herself, Mary Ann baked Timothy Leary a birthday cake. Can you imagine that? That your wife, who is the mother of your 2 children who are sleeping in that house, she bakes you a birthday cake to show you how much she loves you, and then she kills herself because you're in love with another woman. And so a lot of people think that this was extremely damaging to Timothy Leary and was something that basically he tried to overcome the rest of his life. But the womanizing, the sleeping around with multiple women, that never really stops for much of his career, much of his life. So in 1959, then 1955, again, now he remarries, or he remarries, but he marries the woman that he fell in love with, that his wife killed herself because of. They only last for like a year. I think they end up getting divorced in 1956 or 1957. And so in 1959 is believed to be the year that Timothy Leary actually takes psychedelic mushrooms for the first time. That he takes psychedelic mushrooms down in Mexico, and that a fellow psychologist over at the University of Berkeley said, "I had this experience using the Mazatec." This is again a sort of native region within Mexico, within the mountains there. That he had experienced this ingestion of what they call the magic mushrooms or the sacred mushrooms within their culture. And he said, "Tim, you got to check this out, that I learned more about psychology during this state than all my years of research." And so Timothy Leary goes down to Mexico and he takes psilocybin mushrooms. And when he takes psilocybin mushrooms in 1959, this basically set him off onto the psychedelic guru figure he's going to become. And so in 1960, then, now he's done the psychedelic mushroom. He's now very much interested in psilocybin. This is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. He gets offered a job at Harvard. Again, within the psychology world, Timothy Leary was actually a very prominent figure. This is before all the psychedelic stuff that'll come later. He was noted for his work on personality. And so he gets hired by Harvard. They're looking for some new young faces and new ideas. And he proposes research on the active ingredients of these magic mushrooms, these sacred mushrooms of Mexico, psilocybin mushrooms. And so Harvard okays his research. So 1960 then begins his partnership with a gentleman named Richard Alpert. Richard Alpert is also one of these new and young psychologists there at Harvard that's been hired, and they're going to partner together to perform this agreed upon research at Harvard, giving people and dosing people with psilocybin mushrooms to see what the effects are. Now, I think they had a concentrated form, so I think they were giving people pills of psilocybin, so it wasn't like they were eating. Maybe they were eating mushrooms. I'm not sure. I've heard different descriptions. But colleagues became very jealous of Timothy Leary because, as I said, even back when he was doing his PhD, he was known as sort of being the party of the life. He had a big personality. He loved to be the center of attention. And because he was like this, well, all the top students, all the graduate students, they were taking his classes. They wanted to be a part of his research program. And this caused some jealousy amongst the other PhDs there at Harvard. And this is going to come back because those PhDs are the one that are actually going to criticize what he's doing, because soon his research moves from more professional research to more pleasurable research. That all of a sudden, instead of more of a sanitized environment, everybody's doing research over at his Harvard home, and young women are involved, and again, sex begins to reemerge. But before they get fired, there's a very famous and important experiment that is done called the Marsh Chapel experiment. This is also referred to as the Good Friday experiment. And this is regards to the chapel over at Boston University. It's called Marsh Chapel. And it was a research project by Walter Pankey. He was a graduate student there at Harvard. He was getting his PhD, I believe. And so he had a research project where he wanted people to take psilocybin mushrooms or psilocybin in the context of a religious environment in the chapel, in the Christian chapel there at Boston University. And so they did this experiment on Good Friday. And they picked 10 theology students to be participants. So 10 graduate theology students participated in this Marsh Chapel Good Friday experiment. And when they did, 9 out of the 10 said that they had a sort of mystical revelation. And so this Marsh Good Friday Chapel experiment is considered to be important because it validated that psychedelics can be used for the promotion of mystical, spiritual, religious experiences. Okay. And so, again, the experiment justified the mystical dimension of psychedelics. This was kind of the angle that they were playing. Now, within the same period in different places, not at the Harvard experiment, but they found that LSD and some of the psilocybin, particularly LSD, was helping with like schizophrenia or alcoholism. Again, this is still debated. It's very contentious. But in 1962, again, after this Marsh Chapel experiment, people start criticizing Leary. Why? Well, his research starts to occur at his home, as opposed to the university. And so what was originally research now starts to becoming pleasure. And all these people start coming to his home to take the psilocybin that he's been given to administer within his research. One of the prominent people who come is the homosexual poet Allen Ginsberg and his husband. And so there's a very interesting, I don't know if it's funny or how you describe it, but there's a story of how Allen Ginsberg had not tripped yet. He had not taken the psilocybin or the LSD, and so his first experience was with Timothy Leary at his Harvard home, again with all these students around too. And apparently Allen Ginsberg and his husband, as soon as they got high, the first thing they did was take all their clothes off. They claimed that they were going to solve world peace, so they were going to get Khrushchev. And who was the president at that time? I forget. Maybe it was Nixon. On the phone. And solve the Cold War, basically. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. I think they ended up calling Jack Kerouac, one of the very influential, again, beatnik generation authors. But yeah, colleagues began to get very upset with Leary because he's hosting all these students, and now he's hosting other people at his home, and he's giving them the psilocybin that's supposed to be done for his academic his academic research. So now other psychologists who once were maybe jealous because of his popularity among students, they were maybe jealous because of how many of the top students were recruited to be observers and participants in his program, now had legitimate reasons to criticize Leary that, well, look what you're doing. This is becoming a party now. This is less about research. This is more about fun. And technically, this is another interesting caveat. Technically, Timothy Leary isn't fired from Harvard. The person who's fired from Harvard is Richard Alpert. Again, Richard Alpert is who becomes Ram Dass. And why did Richard Alpert get fired? Because he broke the one rule Harvard asked them not to break. What was it? They said, do not give any of the psilocybin to undergraduate students. Do not give it to undergraduate students. And what does he do? Richard Alpert, a sort of closeted homosexual at that time, now coming out more as homosexual, built a homosexual relationship with one of the undergraduate male students, and he administered and allowed him to participate in the psilocybin research. And this is where Harvard immediately fired Richard Alpert. He was like the first professor in 10 years to be fired from Harvard. And Timothy Leary used this as an excuse to also follow him. So the mystique that Leary was technically fired from Harvard, it's actually not totally accurate. Technically, Leary wasn't fired yet, but he chose to resign or quit, and so eventually they ended his salary, and that's in 1963, and that's what's often described as Timothy Leary getting fired from Harvard. Actually, he didn't get fired. It was Richard Alpert that got fired, and he followed Richard Alpert, and then also Ralph Metzner, who's a very important other figure, followed Leary as well. So that's why they got ousted out of Harvard. And so now you have Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner, the three psychologists leading this psilocybin research project at Harvard, now without a place to go. And so what happens? Well, this woman named Peggy Hitchcock, she invites these men to go to, again, she is the heir of the Mellon empire. So Andrew Mellon, his family, his wealth was one of the largest in America at that time. And so her two brothers owned this huge house, this mansion in upstate New York, in Millbrook, New York. And I think it had like 200 some acres. It was ginormous. And she basically gave it to Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner to continue their research. And Timothy Leary basically lives there from the end of 1963 to about mid-1967, later 1967, where then he moves over to the West Coast. Again, Summer of Love. Summer of Love is 1967. So 67 is a major, major year for the counterculture. But Peggy Hitchcock basically gives him the Millbrook estate to continue their research. And so I want to use and share some of these videos with you guys. I really hope, I was trying to make sure none of these videos had ads on them, so it might not be taken down. I really hope I'm not taken down for showing you guys these, because I think they're so interesting that I want to show you guys some of this stuff. So this is an interview with Timothy Leary. Well, here's one that I can definitely show you. So this is an LSD session at Millbrook. So here, this is 1967. So this is 4 years. For 4 years, Timothy Leary has been at this mansion in upstate New York, and I want to show you what it looks like. And this is him. He would record, again, that's what that article we began with. I was talking about the CIA association with Timothy Leary, about his Leary archives, that he would record himself, that he would walk around with a microphone, and he would have video cameras, and he would record himself, and he literally had a huge archive of the experiments he had done, the people that had come. And so this is one little clip. They're hard to find. They're very hard to find, the Leary archive videos. Here is one little sample so you can see what it was like. Okay.
This is the center of the LSD religion in the United States. We have come here, as men have done for millions of years, to get away from the insanity of American society. We find God here in our body. We find it in flowers. We find it in our senses. And we find it in love for our fellow man and for all forms of life. This is a meditation house. For the last 4 years, people come here day and night to take LSD and to find God. These people that you see here today are right now in the middle of an LSD session. They're participating and celebrating their religious experience. This large house is the center during the winter for our life and for our worship. This young man in the white shirt, and he wandered by in the middle of an LSD session and said, "Why do you bother to talk when God's message is all around us? There's no need to fight. There's no need to compete. We're here in the Garden of Eden. Turn on, tune in to this wonderful nature, and drop out of society, warfare, competition." I don't really think we need machinery.
You see how interesting it is that Leary, again, filmed himself. He has this microphone, and obviously somebody else is actually filming this whole experience. This black gentleman is high on LSD along with some of the other participants, but there used to be way more footage of all this stuff on YouTube, because I remember looking at it when I was deep into the psychedelic stuff, that you could find a lot more of the footage of him at Millbrook, but I couldn't find hardly anything really. So somebody has taken a lot of this stuff off. Well, I don't want the music to play. That may actually be an
attempt to pervert.
That may be a copyright strike. So let me flip over to this other video that I wanted to show you guys. That this is so this interview is from 1966. Okay, so remember 1963. 1963. Aldous Huxley dies. JFK. That's when JFK dies in 63. MLK, I believe, in 63. C.S. Lewis in 63. 63 is when these three gentlemen, these three psychologists, get kicked out of Harvard, and now they move up to this house in Millbrook, New York, upstate New York. And this is an interview from the CBC Canada in 1966. 1966. So check this out. I am going to try to comment and stop the video because this one's 14 minutes. It's very interesting, though. It's so insightful to the context, the historical context of all this stuff. But I don't want to get the video taken down, so I'm not going to try to play it for more than maybe 2 or 3 minutes at a time.
Dr. Timothy Leary, once a clinical psychologist and Harvard professor, now, by his own description, a visionary prophet. Others have called him the man most responsible for the North American crisis over LSD.
Dr. Leary, what are you up to here?
We teach the science and art of ecstasy. We teach people how to turn on or how to go out of their minds. By turn on, we mean to tune in, to get beyond your routine ways of thinking and acting and experiencing. And we often say that we're teaching people how to use their head. The point is that in order to use your head, you have to go out of your mind. You have to go out of all of the static, symbolic ways in which you think, experience. Most of us, most of the time, see the world through a very small set of filters. You use perhaps 1/1,000,000th of the potential energy and wisdom that's inside your head. So then people say, no matter what they say about LSD, we always translate it into using your head. So if they say LSD is dangerous, they say, your consciousness is dangerous.
You're not saying LSD cannot be misused, but surely.
Well, of course, it's a form of energy, and it releases energy. And any form of energy which man has discovered can be used for ill or for good. It can be used to gain power, control over other people, or it can be used to help people develop and grow. When you take LSD, you don't go out and get involved in fights, or you don't go out and get involved in activity. It's an internal experience.
What about going out a window and getting involved with the sidewalk 12 floors under?
Well, the hundreds of thousands of people who have taken LSD, how many people have done that? The statistics show that taking LSD is no more dangerous than signing up for a 4-year course at Harvard College. A certain percentage of people who do either are going to get into trouble, but there's no scientific evidence that LSD causes any such...
Any distortion of the sort of root, say, suicide statistic or the...
So one of the other videos, again, they're getting ready to get into the suicide statistics. And I do want to clarify, thank you for the chat room. MLK dies when RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, dies in 68. No, he does not die in 63 when JFK. I got that switched. I got that mixed up in my head. But what I wanted to highlight was that Timothy Leary, he's getting ready to be confronted about, again, some of the suicide statistics and the mental illness. This is something, again, if you watch the second half of this stream, which is up over at the website for members, that William F. Buckley pushes Leary on this fact that how many people were getting deep into sort of major mental psychological illness due to not knowing what exactly they were getting into with all this LSD stuff. And they would take way too much. They didn't know what they were getting into. They wanted to get out of the trip once it starts. And again, it's not going to stop. You're gonna have to ride that ride for a while. And so eventually I want to show you this video after Timothy Leary gets out of prison, and Art Linkletter, you know, the guy who did the show Kids Say the Darndest Things, his daughter dies from a attempted suicide on LSD. She actually jumped out of a window, I believe, and killed herself. And Art Linkletter, which again, this hasn't happened yet. We're going to watch an interview from, I think, 76 or 77. And Art Linkletter blamed Timothy Leary for the death of his daughter.
For the root.
Or mental hospital commitments.
Mental hospital commitments.
There's no evidence that LSD causes this, and there's evidence that it doesn't cause it, any more than you would expect by chance in a population of 1,000 people. But when you take LSD and your conscience expanded, the number of possibilities and the number of perspectives dramatically multiplies. And then you're in real ontological confusion. That's why we always have urged people, don't take LSD unless you're very well prepared, unless you're specifically prepared to go out of your mind. Don't take it unless you have someone that's very experienced with you to guide you through it. And don't take it unless you are ready to have your perspective on yourself and life dramatically change, because you're going to be a different person, and you should be ready to face this possibility.
Timothy Leary's rented estate is almost as fantastic by day as it is by night. 3,000 acres, complete with man-made lakes, in the rolling woodlands of upstate New York.
The estate was built by a wealthy madman 70 years ago, and it's been the home, I guess, for people who want to go out of their minds ever since. It is mad in the sense that someone has to have some sort of magical vision to build walls and meditation houses and Bavarian ski lodges somewhere around here. incredibly magical place. Every few hundred yards has a little shrine of some sort. Some of the guests have been...
Just to avoid copyright strike, I'm going to stop and comment. But you can see how communal this house became. Now, one of the problems is it moves, and again, I'll talk about this here in a few, is that Peggy Hitchcock gives the Millbrook estate to Leary for his research. Now, by 1965, more and more people just kept on coming. And eventually, Millbrook had basically an open door policy. And so anybody and everybody could come in. And it was known, even Timothy Leary has admitted, that CIA agents, probably FBI agents, various informants would come in and participate in their stuff and take notes and observe and document, and then they would go back. There's one video that you can find online of the police officer talking about how they were setting up an operation to sort of spy on the Millbrook estate and find out what exactly was going on there, because one of the rumors that some of the neighbors didn't like so much is that they were having orgies and there was a lot of sex and a lot of promiscuity and all this different stuff going on. So notice how many women are there. Notice how many people are at the house, all, again, taking LSD and various psychedelic substances.
Asked to play the role of cooks, cameramen, candle lighters, and we're going to keep shifting everything we do this weekend. Actually, there's some possibility that I'm just a visitor here for the weekend, reading a script that was handed to me by the people who run this place. So you're never going to be sure exactly who's who and who's supposed to do what. Because at any moment you may be asked to run a psychedelic session, or to cook a meal, or to run a television camera, or to weed the garden.
In his natural habitat, the prophet preaches. Timothy Leary in a Saturday morning session of words and silences.
The first several years that we were engaged in psychedelic research, we deliberately tried not to impose any kind of session programs or any models or metaphors or theories on the psychedelic experience. During the first few years of our research, we concentrated on making the experience pleasant and educational and safe. The session tonight we're going to use as the model a voyage into your own body. The human brain receives several billion signals a minute. Your brain is being flooded with millions of coded messages from all parts of your body every second. Most of us, most of the time, are completely blocked from awareness of the information which is flooding into our nervous system. Often, people during LSD sessions get trapped where their consciousness floats into one of these areas of the nervous system.
One of the things he was popular of saying is that that the LSD allows all the communication of your cells and your mitochondria and all the biological machinery of your body that goes back millennia, again, rooted in a sort of Darwinian Wallace theory of evolution. And so if you go into the LSD, the psychedelic state, that you can have access to all this innate information inside your body that you can't have access to in a sober mindset.
Be lost there because you don't recognize it, and to suffer tremendous anguish or experience incredible new ecstasies as you whirl through this center, to slowly dissolve and go back down the history of your own nervous system and experience the ecstasy of the root beginning. But the terror is that you'll never get back, or that you're just going to slowly spiral down some central sewer in the middle of this universe, and boom, that'll be the end of you. And at that point, you begin grabbing and struggling to pull out of this. The advice is to recognize and float along with it. The second chakra, called the sexual chakra, is located at the root of the genitals. Now actually, complete sexual experience involves...
You see, again, the Eastern mysticism and the occult language is so common during all this stuff. And now he's getting into the chakra system and how the LSD, the psychedelics allow you to activate the innate energy centers of the body, of which is again, total nonsense.
All of your centers and all of your consciousness. But the imagery of this center is dominated by the joyous, slippery union of male and female at all levels of evolutionary development. Now, they don't mean that you are fantasizing having a sexual affair with Marilyn Monroe. That's the most gamey aspect of the principle that's involved here. It means that your consciousness is hooked up to the basic male-female electrical process, which is expressed at every level of life in your body, because the consciousness of the sexual chakra is much broader than overt sex. Molecules, cells, germs, tissues, all higher forms, sliding together in the polar embrace. There comes the awareness that the 2 billion year chain of life, of all life, is simply the endless dance of couples, coupling in fierce ecstasy. The terror of the sexual chakra comes, as all terrors come, from the desperate attempt to hold on to the external symbolic ego. As you slip into moist, intertwined union, you discover that you are vulnerable and soft, and that you have given up your cherished individuality and all of your defenses. Your identity is merging in the union. You become aware of this incessant beat of all life in the universe, pulsing into every corner of your body. The ecstasy of this center is union of your flow and pulse in the river of all life.
I love how he uses, and this is something, if you go to the website and see the second half of this stream with William F. Buckley, I comment on this, the poetic language that William F. Buckley actually stops Timothy Leary. He begins quoting these sort of phrases like he's using now, and he's like, well, I speak English, I know English fairly well. What exactly are you saying? Because he uses all these words. It is very poetic. It's very romanticized language that I think, again, fools a lot of us when we don't have the sort of cognitive apparatus, the categorical sophistication to understand these things and the paradigms and the spiritual theology of all this stuff, that you kind of get swept up in the romanticism, which is, again, a sort of passionate experience with language, and that's exactly the sort of passionate dimension is what these psychedelic drugs do, obviously. So
the harmony of your heartbeat with the pulse of all life. And this is the classic experience of unity which mystics have been writing about for thousands of years. Have I answered the question, who am I? Mm-hmm. Well, I confront it all the time. As I said earlier, we think of ourselves as members of a very traditional organization of men who have been asking the question, what's what, and who is man, and what is this energy process all about? I went into psychology 20 years ago, basically as a career. I was simple-minded enough to take seriously the mottos of psychology, that psychology is supposed to be finding out what goes on with the human being. And 5 years ago, by accident in Mexico, I took Mexican mushrooms, the so-called magic mushrooms of Mexico, and I learned more about my brain and its possibilities, and I learned more about psychology in the 5 hours after taking these mushrooms than I had in the preceding 15 years studying, doing research in psychology. And since that day, which was just exactly 5 years ago this week, I've done practically nothing except continue this exploration that was triggered off by this accidental experience in Mexico. Of finding out what are the range and limits of consciousness, and attempting to develop maps and languages for charting these incredible realms within our own skull, that not just of what's going on around you and inside of you, but also consciousness of where you came from, and the long telephone wire of history, which goes back 2 billion years, which is buried somewhere inside your brain and mine. We are neurologically and biochemically in touch with thousands of generations that came before us. And the record of these previous evolutionary attempts are there. It's just that our mental, symbolic minds can't decode these messages. And men have been discovering this experience and developing methods to get high or to go out of their mind for thousands of years. And LSD is simply the modern yoga made possible by advances in science, which have produced these incredible chemicals, which we call psychedelic drugs.
Okay. So that gives you a little glimpse into what was going on in Millbrook, New York, at the estate, again, of Peggy Hitchcock, the heir of the Andrew Mellon estate, one of the wealthiest families in America. And so around this time, so probably in 1964, 1965, you get what some of you guys maybe have heard of as the Merry Pranksters, and you get Ken Kesey in 1964. So while Leary and Alpert and Ralph Metzner and all these different people, you know, the Beatles at that Millbrook estate, that's where the Beatles tripped with Leary. Many musicians would come and have their guided psychedelic trips. One of the ways Leary was making money at that time, again, he was living rent-free at that mansion, but one of the ways he was making money was charging people to come and be guided into psychedelic states with himself. Now, what I was going to say is in 1964-65, while he's over in Millbrook on the East Coast in New York, over on the West Coast in California, you had what are called the Merry Pranksters, and Ken Kesey driving around in a bus trying to ask people if they want to do the acid test and give them LSD, and he eventually wrote a book in 1968 called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. So you can buy that book and get into some of the details in regards to the Merry Pranksters. Now, they had a very different approach with Leary. Leary, again, had this sort of guru status. He'd use a lot of romantic language, a lot of scientific jargon in regards to describing. Again, he has a PhD in psychology. So it has a little bit of a different aura than you see the merry pranksters. It's these young guys going around giving anybody and everybody acid, making a lot of noise. At one point, I think in 65, they actually make their way to New York, upstate New York, to Millbrook. And Timothy Leary didn't want to deal with them. I heard Ken Kesey actually say that he thought Leary was being a bit of a snob because they came in, again, really loud, Leary really boisterous, obnoxious, basically, the Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, and Timothy Leary wasn't really interested. So he claimed that he had been tripping all night before and that he was just going to bed, and he didn't want to meet them. So the two big proponents of the LSD during the mid-1960s and into the Summer of Love, they actually never met, even though at one point they were at the same house, this Millbrook estate in upstate New York, but Timothy Leary didn't really want anything to do with them. So it's 1965. Again, more and more people are now coming to the Millbrook estate, the Millbrook mansion. Now Timothy Leary is really getting this national reputation as, quote, the psychedelic guru. And the whole legend begins to sort of take off. Now, by 1967, so this is the same year which he ends up going to travel back to the West Coast. He's eventually going to leave New York and go to California. In 1967, he actually gets married for the fourth time. Now, remember, his first wife, Mary Ann, dies of suicide because Timothy Leary falls in love with one of the students at University of Berkeley, California. Then he marries that student after his wife commits suicide, and they only are married for a year. Then he's single, and then he goes through the Harvard experience. He gets into the Millbrook stuff, and eventually marries, I think, the supermodel for like a year. I think she was German or something, but a very beautiful woman. She was like a supermodel. She had come to the Millbrook estate. They get married. That's for a year, and then he marries this woman named Rosemary, and they're together through, again, the point in which he gets incarcerated. He's a fugitive, international fugitive on the run, and then eventually she goes underground. But what's really interesting and makes me think that, again, by this time he is already full-blown in congruence with the CIA is that in 1967, again, he decides with his wife, Rosemary, that he's going to take his kids, Susan and Jack. Remember that first wife, Mary Ann, they had 2 kids together before she committed suicide. That his children were living with him at that house, the house that you just saw in all those videos, the Millbrook estate. His kids were living with him. And so they decide that they're going to go south. And so they pack up the car and they're going to drive to Mexico. And they get met at the Mexico-America border and told to basically turn around. And when they turn around, customs stops them, the police stop them, and strip search them. They believe, and Timothy Leary's mentioned before, that he thinks his phone and stuff was tapped, but he's arrested for 1/8 of an ounce of marijuana that's found in his daughter's underwear. So his daughter's underwear is where they were hiding the cannabis, I guess. The authorities arrest him, and they sentence him to a 30-year prison sentence, if you can imagine that. A 30-some year, I think it was 39. I've heard 30 and 39, so at least 30-year prison sentence. He bails himself out, and he drives back up to Millbrook, that estate up in upstate New York. And this is when then we start to see the federal government, some of the military agencies really start to produce some of the anti-LSD propaganda. And I don't mean propaganda meaning it's negative. I just mean that they would claim that it definitely leads to suicide, that you'll lose your mind, all this different stuff. So you see these two radical polar opposites, right? So you see Timothy Leary actually in congruence and funded and helped by the CIA promoting a lot of this stuff, and then you see a lot of the federal agencies also then condemning it and putting out these radical descriptions. It's almost like reefer madness. That you're gonna like, kill somebody if you smoke cannabis or something. They put out this stuff regarding LSD and the losing of one's mind. So that really gets ramped up in 1967. Now, again, 1967 is the summer of love. So the counterculture and the hippie movement is in full swing at this point. So in 1967-68, again, he's really pushing hard to turn on, tune in, and drop out. The communes then, this is a really interesting fact, is that between 67 and 68, again, so basically from 65 to 67, 68, Leary's really putting out the turn on, tune in, and drop out. That communes around the United States get drastically increased during this period. So people really were dropping out to a degree, and they started building communes all across the United States. Now, Leary is eventually arrested over 12 times in the late 60s. So since this major arrest at the Mexican border, he gets arrested like 12 more times within the 67, 68, 69 period. The White House, there's even a quote from Richard Nixon claiming that Timothy Leary was the most dangerous man in America. And they identified Timothy Leary as basically the figurehead of the countercultural movement, and that he was the oldest. He had sort of the highest credentials, being a Harvard PhD or former. He was the most popular. He would be at the sort of the well-to-do parties of the wealthy elite who wanted him to bring his LSD and his psilocybin. And he'd also shown up in Esquire and Playboy magazine. And so Timothy Leary just seemed to be everywhere. And so the White House identified him as the head figure, the leader of the counterculture. And so in 1968, the 30-year prison sentence, that 30-year prison sentence from Mexico gets overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States. Interesting, right? The Supreme Court of the United States drops that prison sentence. And he's now living in Northern California. He's in the hills of Northern California, probably outside the Bay Area. And it's funny, and in one interview, he announces that he's going to run for governor. Now that this big charge that had kind of been looming over him, this charge of cannabis possession at the Mexican border, now it's been overturned by the Supreme Court, and he argues that, or he states that he's going to run for California governor against Ronald Reagan. So obviously Reagan ended up winning that, but it became a very popular sort of meme at the time. So then in 1970, Timothy Leary gets arrested for marijuana possession. Now, it's claimed that he had two joints, and they arrest him for a 10-year prison sentence. And this is when I told you that the incarcerated individuals had to take this exam, this personality psychological exam, of which Timothy Leary actually helped create. And so he knew how to answer these particular specific questions. And so when the detention center, when the prison got his test scores back, even though he was identified again by the White House as the most dangerous man in America, he tested that he was absolutely nonviolent, the least likely to escape, the least threatening of prisoners, and so they put him in the most minimalist retention center inside the prison. And so what does he end up doing? He breaks out late at night. He climbs onto the roof. He jumps onto the telephone wire, the electrical telephone wire, and he hand by hand climbs across the telephone wire to the telephone pole, which is just outside the fence of the prison, shimmies down the telephone pole, and he's picked up by his wife, Rosemary. And he's smuggled out of the United States by the Weathermen Underground. So, very, very interesting stuff, no doubt. And so then he's smuggled out of the United States. He's brought to Algeria. He goes to Algeria and is protected briefly by the Black Panthers, because the Black Panthers were sort of the head of the leftist progressive movement during the 1960s. They were definitely considered the most violent, the most authoritative. And they had an exile government in Algeria, and they Eldridge Cleaver, I couldn't remember his name. Eldridge Cleaver, the leader of the Black Panthers, allowed Timothy Leary and Rosemary to stay there, but then they started inviting all their guests. They started inviting other people, and of course they had their drugs with them. And Eldridge Cleaver ended up saying, well, they ended up just coming in and kicking their ass out. And so they both were kicked out of Algeria, and they were on the run. And they were on the run for multiple months. Eventually, they split up. Timothy doesn't want Rosemary to be with him. And so she eventually, I think, gets back to the United States somehow. And he gets caught in Afghanistan and gets rearrested. This is when and so he was on the run for 18 months after getting kicked out of Algeria by the Black Panthers. So he's on the run for 18 months and then eventually gets captured in Afghanistan, and that's when he really starts to give up names in regards and works with the FBI and the CIA on who helped break him out of prison, who helped smuggle him out of the country, his contacts for the drugs, where he's getting it, all this different stuff. Of course, probably was the CIA the whole time. I wouldn't be surprised, again, that their drug running, that they were probably his biggest supplier. Who knows? And so eventually Timothy Leary goes to prison, and that's what I want to show you guys next, is a little video clip of him now in prison. So this is 1973, okay? So I'm getting ready to show you a video. This is 1973. Timothy Leary has already, his time at the Millbrook estate. He's been the leader of the counterculture, the Summer of Love in 67, Woodstock 69. He gets arrested in 70. He's on the run for over 18 months around the world. And now he's rearrested, and he's now in prison. This is an interview, and check this out. This is just a clip, and then we'll move on.
Sitting here in prison, what are you doing productively? What are you doing to keep yourself alert?
Well, I have no trouble keeping myself alert. There's plenty to do here. The main thing I'm doing is taking advantage of this opportunity to study society from this very interesting vantage point. I'm talking to prisoners, I'm listening to them, I'm doing some writing. I do about 2 hours of physical yoga every day. There's no problem. This is where it's happening. As I said before, it's a microcosm. You've got all the raw essence of human society here. This is where you can really see it coming down. It's a rare experience. It's nothing that I want to make a career of, but it's my ambition to really liberate the world. Why not? I mean, why settle for anything less? And I have a sense of humor about it. I know the odds are against me, but we only have a few years here. Let's try to leave this spaceship a better place. And all the models and all the philosophers and all the men that I think have really liberated humanity have all done their time on the outside. I want to get back in. I think I belong in American society. I think that a society that imprisons its philosophers is playing with very bad magic. You just can't imprison ideas.
You've been arrested a number of times for possession of marijuana. Were any of those legitimate?
No, as a matter of fact, I've never been legitimately arrested. I'm in prison now because one evening I was in a parked car and a policeman came up to the car and opened the door against my wishes, made a pass at the ashtray and said, "You're under arrest for," I said, "For what?" He said, "For marijuana." I said, "What marijuana?" He reached in his pocket. He pulled out 2 joints I'd never seen before, half joints, and said, "You're under arrest." A year later, an Orange County, Orange County jury believed the policeman's story and found me guilty of possession of marijuana. Now then the judge, instead of giving me bail, as I was entitled to for appeal, held up a book that I had been writing and said, "Your ideas are dangerous, and we're not going to give you bail, and we'll put you in prison to keep you quiet." Now, I'm not complaining, because I think I should have been shut up then. I've been around the United States for 10 years talking and spreading my message, and I think it's good in a public life to a chance to lay back and to see what the opposition is going to do. As a matter of fact, when I was arrested, I was running for governor of California, and I published position papers on how to gradually eliminate taxes, how to eliminate crime, how to eliminate the drug abuse problem, and so forth. I thought I'd lay back for a couple of years and see how well the other side was going to do. But last January in Afghanistan, the American government agents, they're part of that same Leary Narcotics Bureau group, stole my passport illegally, kidnapped me.
Valid passport?
It was a valid passport on the sovereign territory of Afghanistan, kidnapped me, put me in a plane, brought me back, and now I'm in Folsom Prison, and I'm broadcasting again. Now, I didn't want to come back. I was happy over there. I was consulting with other governments on how they could avoid the crime and the drug problem we have here. But now that I'm back, I am going to be broadcasting.
You say that that arrest was not a legitimate one. Let me rephrase that. Do you think the sentence was put on you extra tough because you are Tim Leary?
One of the things that I always thought about is, again, if he wasn't, like, all the circumstances in which he never went to prison, like, again, the 30-year prison sentence from the Mexican incident, and then that gets overturned by the Supreme Court. There's another incident where he was arrested for marijuana as well, and the grand jury overturned that indictment as well. So there's multiple incidences in Timothy Leary's life where it seems like a normal person would have gone to prison, yet somehow he miraculously, through the federal system, they overturned those decisions, which, again, if the CIA was allowing him to promote this message, push this message on Americans, it makes a lot of sense. And the fact, even here, he's only in prison for 3 full years before he's let out. So all this stuff occurs, and then eventually he's still let out, and he doesn't go back to jail for the rest of his life. So again, seems a bit iffy.
I don't think, first place, I don't think that anyone should go to prison for the possession of marijuana. So it's unfair for everybody. I don't think there's any question, though, that if another middle-aged, middle-class person was found with 2 these in their pocket, they wouldn't be doing prison time. But I am Timothy Leary. I don't think it's so much my ideas, because there are a lot of people running around preaching new ideas. The reason I'm in prison is because my ideas were listened to by millions of people. They got a little too popular. That's my version of it.
Then you went on to Algiers. You lived over there with Eldridge Cleaver and his wife Kathleen. What do you think of Eldridge Cleaver as a man? His beliefs, his feelings? There was a big rift there after you had lived there for a while.
Yes, Eldridge Cleaver and I disagreed strongly on philosophy and on how to change the world. I believe that the revolution is a neurological revolution. It's a revolution of consciousness. I saw it more as a spiritual revolution. Eldridge, as you probably know, believed in a violent military revolution, and I felt that this was old-fashioned and would get easily wiped out and create bad vibrations where we wanted good vibrations.
Some people say that perhaps your use of LSD and other drugs, you might have destroyed some of your brain. Do you think that you've suffered any brain damage whatsoever?
Well, am I insane? Of course, that's a very tricky question for anyone to answer. I've lived through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and I think anyone who's still erect after those years has had his sanity tested. I'm 52 years old, facing the problems of maturity and getting old. I've been through a lot of rough time the last few years. My career has been ruined, and they took my credit card away at Harvard, and I've been harassed by the United States government pretty heavily. I've been in 4 prisons, all without committing any crime I know of. I've been in solitary confinement for 4 months. In addition to all of these pressures, I probably pushed my nervous system as much as any human being living. I think I'm the strongest, sanest person around. Now, I'm not making any guarantees for the future, but, you know, there's something very ominous about this tendency to call anybody that you don't agree with insane. 100 years ago, they'd say you were possessed by the devil, or you were a heretic. 20 years ago, they'd say you were a communist. Now, the really sophisticated totalitarian method now is to to say that someone that is a dissenter, that is against the society, is insane. In Russia now, very smooth. They take their philosophers and their dissenting poets, and they don't put them in Siberia anymore. They put them in an insane asylum. Now, maybe it is insane to be against what's happening in the United States today. Maybe it's insane to try to have hope that something can be done about it. So if that's insane, count me in. But otherwise, make up your own mind.
You're an optimist, hope-themed.
So that's basically the end of that. The end of that interview there. So that's Timothy Leary in prison. And then now I want to show you guys a quick one of him being released. So this is 3 years later. So he's only in prison for 3 years. 3 years. I liked what you guys were saying in the chat that these people are perpetual actors. I'm not. I'm not positive on how exactly. Maybe because he gave up so much information, that's how he was able to get his sentence reduced so much that he's only in prison for 3 years. Because for me, if you break out of prison and then you're on the run from the federal government for 18 months, you'd think that you'd have a pretty strict penalty, but I don't know. So anyways, here is then Leary being released from prison. This is from 1976.
Got anything to say, Dr. Leary?
How you feel, Sam? I feel beautiful. Great. I want to thank Joanna and Mr. Milano and all my friends who helped me get out. And to those who didn't help, I want to be reassuring. It's all going to work out all right. And in particular, I want to send a message of support to Andrei Sakharov, who's doing the same thing in Russia. Great, Tim! Right. Hey, Mr. Leary. Have a good time. Bless you, Tim.
So now let's continue with the timeline here. And so that's 1976. He's now let out of prison. Timothy Leary goes back on to the lecture circuit, and he really begins. So the next stage of the Timothy Leary saga is really about transhumanism from this point forward. So if you were if you're familiar with Robert Anton Wilson, he actually begins to do quite a bit of work with Robert Anton Wilson, another major proponent of Aleister Crowley's work, and they talk a lot about transhumanism. So giving up on the drugs, they have the same yearning. They have this same yearning for internal enlightenment, internal bliss, internal spiritual knowledge, but now it's the rhetoric begins to move much towards how technology can take us there, the internet, personal computers, and this is still, and I would consider Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson and maybe Terence McKenna the major progenitors of this transhumanism stuff within the psychedelic scene, because it's rampant. And it seems so counterintuitive. You think, oh, well, the psychedelic people, they're all into nature and natural things and natural living and organic practices. But at the same time, Silicon Valley, one of the most psychedelic places, especially microdosing, they love microdosing there, is one of the most occultic places. That was a big surpriser when I was living in Berkeley, is that you find out how popular occultism is. It's really, really, really popular. And so the occultism and then the Silicon Valley, all these tech nerds, all these tech geeks, and again, all that power, the technological power there in Silicon Valley is mixed with psychedelics. Psychedelics are in a very central part of their culture. And again, like if you look into microdosing, a lot of people talk about the microdosing phenomenon in Silicon Valley, but the rhetoric of the transhumanism is still alive with us very, very much. And so you can see, as people like Dyer has highlighted, other people regarding some of the larger agendas behind all this stuff, how as we as Orthodox Christians, we as conservative traditional Christians, the stuff that we're up and facing against in the world, the transhumanism, the sexual liberation, the feminism, the degeneracy, all this stuff really got its founding ground in the counterculture, and all of it was pushed by the government, by the CIA, by the FBI. So in 1976, Leary is released from prison, and then he lives in California, and like I said, travels around. He writes multiple books. He does a lot of talking about the use of technology, the internet, and then eventually goes on a speaking tour with G. Gordon Liddy. G. Gordon Liddy was actually a guy who, first he became popular for, he went to prison for his role in Watergate, but he kind of was a name around the White House, and he was a very critical individual of Timothy Leary and wanted him arrested. Ironically, they both get arrested around the same time. They both spend time in prison, and then when they get out, they end up touring the country together, doing lectures and making money together. So, funny coincidence there. In 1995, eventually Timothy Leary is diagnosed with prostate cancer. And his prostate cancer is what eventually kills him, and he according to his obituary, he put his ashes in a rocket and shot it into space, and that his ashes are still in orbit, hovering around the Earth to this day. Now, I know that's going to be controversial for some of you out there in regards to the structure of the Earth and space and all that different stuff, but that kind of ends the whole discussion here on the life and death of Dr. Timothy Leary. Now, if you guys have any super chats, any questions, any comments you'd like to add to the chat, please send those in. I have one last video that I want to share with you guys before hopping off here. So if you'd like to support the channel, you'd like to show some love for the stream, you'd like to ask a particular question or comment on the topic at hand today, please send in a super chat, preferably with the Streamlabs links. That's pinned in the comment section. It's also in the video description. Or use YouTube. If you prefer the YouTube super chat, you can use that as well. So the last video that I wanted to show you guys, and I believe it's not copyrighted. I haven't seen any ads on it. And so maybe I'll play a little bit and then I'll stop and comment. But this is a thank you very much, Thomas Henderson. This is a little interview that Timothy Leary does. I don't exactly know the show. It's saying Planet Pop TV. Here, I'll pull it up for you guys. Let's see here. There we go. So this Planet Pop TV, that Timothy Leary, this is after, this is in I think this is 1978, 78. So this is maybe a couple years, or I don't know how recently. Maybe it's 76, 77, 78, somewhere around there. Timothy Leary has been now out of prison, and he goes on this television show where basically they have prepared to humiliate him. And Art Linkletter, again, the person who ran Kids Say the Darndest Things, his daughter jumps out of a window on LSD. Art Linkletter attributes the death to Timothy Leary. And I just wanted to show this not because I'm on anybody's side. I just think that is really entertaining. And if you hadn't seen it, I thought it's worth checking out. So check this little clip out. Again, thank you very much. I'll get to the super chats here in just a minute. Thank you very much, Stevie. Thank you very much, Thomas Henderson. And again, if you guys have any questions or comments you'd like to discuss, please send that in using the Streamlabs link or the YouTube super chat if that's what you prefer. So check this out.
Okay, we're talking to Dr. Timothy Leary, who you really should know about. For those who lived through the 60s, and most of us did, this man was extremely important, and that's why you're here, because you were so associated with the drug culture. Let me also refresh your memory. 9 years ago, Art Linkletter's 21-year-old daughter, or rather 20-year-old daughter, Diane, took a fatal fatal 6-story plunge to her death. You leaving, Dr. Leary? Why are you leaving? Why are you leaving? Seriously, you're not leaving. I want you to sit right here. I want you to sit down. You're not leaving. I want you to sit down.
I'm under arrest.
Oh, you're not under arrest. I want you to sit down. Art, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Art? Art Linkletter?
Art, are you there?
I want you to stay for a while. I want you to stay. I'm not sandbagging, but I want you to come to this in an intelligent way and not be funny. You're 60 years old, a grown man. Please sit down here. No one leaves this show. They answer the questions. Art Linkletter, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Art? Art Linkletter is in Columbus, Ohio. And I apologize, we're apparently having some phone problems. His 20-year-old daughter, as you know, plunged to her death, jumped out of a window. He claims that people who manufactured and sold LSD were responsible for her death. Do you think that's true?
Well, later understood he admitted that she hadn't had LSD for several months before that. Now, the relationship between Art Linkletter and his daughter, or the relationship between Art Linkletter, who's made a living for 20 or 30 years making fun of kids, you know, things that happened 10 years ago.
Dr. Leary, do you see any relationship between her death caused by in other words, do you think that LSD was a part of her death, the fact that she committed suicide?
How does anyone know? I would say the chances are 1,000-1 no.
So
But Art certainly made a lot of money and got on a lot of shows. He got himself into the Nixon White House.
How many?
Riding on the death of his daughter.
Dr. Leary, how many?
And I think that's ghoulish.
How many LSD
ghoulish
trips?
for people like
Dr.
Carol
Leary?
Burnett, whose ratings are going down.
Let me ask
Carol
you this
Burnett
question. Do we have a phone
forcing
call?
her daughter.
Art, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm sorry, we have technical problems. Dr. Timothy Leary is here. Let me ask you this question. I know that Diane died in 1970. What part did LSD play in this, in your judgment?
It played a very vital part, and it caused her to become bewildered and agonized about life and take her own life. And in
Art, I think it was you that caused her.
Wait a minute. Dr. Leary?
Your hypocrisy.
All right, no, wait a minute.
And you're riding it. You got to the Nixon White House, didn't you? Because you became on the basis of his daughter's death.
No, wait a minute.
He rides
That's an
into the
outrage, Tim.
That's ghoulish.
Oh, stop. I will throw you off the show if you don't listen to these questions.
Well,
Art, let me ask you this.
I know.
Art Linkletter?
Yes.
I apologize to
Would
you.
you take the microphone away from that idiot and let me talk for a minute?
Yes, I will. Go ahead, Art. Tell us what you want to say.
In subsequent investigations following her death, I have absolute definite proof that Diane had mentioned Dr. Leary as one of the reasons why she thought that there was nothing wrong with LSD and believed what he said when he said it was God's gift to young people. And I think that this man, Dr. Leary, I had hoped he would die. I had hoped he would be hung. Then I had hoped he'd stay in prison for life. And now I'm glad he's out as a pitiful example of an aging hippie, a gruesome spectacle of how drugs can ruin a brilliant mind, a third-rate comic in cheap nightclubs with a routine that evokes pity. I've seen it on TV, exploited like any ex-convict with a sensational past. And I predict and hope and pray that his next appearance in show business is where he belongs, in the sideshow of a circus, not as a barker, but as a freak inside.
Art, how do you know? You mentioned documentation. Which, by the way, do you want to respond? I've never seen a more withering blast in my life. You must respond to that.
Oh, I've had dozens of them.
But I mean, seriously. I mean, that would have been it for me.
Go on. What are you going to say?
How do you know that? What evidence do you have of the documentation that LSD was responsible for her death?
Well, it's an absolute fact. Her boyfriend, her brother, she talked to her brother several times before she died. She was getting flashbacks from LSD. She was not a drug addict. She was an experimenter like so many of the young kids who were believing. And mind you, I do not blame Dr. Leary for all of this. I think he was an important part of it. Such things as Grace Slick and the Jefferson Airplane and the rock group singing the songs of drugs. People who were like Ginsberg the poet, and even Aldous Huxley in his Doors of Perception was talking about the glories of drug abuse. It was a drug world, but Timothy Leary happened to be an intellectual, university-based guru and gave the youngsters a kind of a rallying point. They weren't just talking about hippies, they were talking about an intellectual leader, and he, who was, by saying these things, was giving them an additional argument for experimentation in this tremendous time of the 60s.
All right, I have a few questions. I'd like to get it off Tim just for a little bit. All right, briefly, what do you say to parents? You've had this experience. You had 5 children. You have 4 now. If the kids...
just so the stream doesn't get turned off, even though this is near the end, I just want to stop real quick and comment. I love I think it was Block Party that somebody said, how do you really feel, Mr. Linkletter? That was hilarious. But yeah, I'm not taking sides on anybody in this particular clip. I just thought it was very interesting. I just wanted to share it with you guys. So now let's check out the rest.
If the parents are involved, if kids are involved in drugs, what do you say to parents? What should they do about it?
Don't panic. Don't beat up on the kid physically or emotionally. Don't rush off and call the cops, but rather develop an attitude of listening and patience and understanding. The first thing every parent should do is to learn something about drugs and stop making it an emotional hot button.
Right.
And I want to tell you a study of teenage kids who do not use drugs or booze. And we're always studying the kids who do, but let's look at the kids who don't. 9 out of 10 of them are close to their parents. 9 out of 10 of them say that their parents check up on them, know what they're doing and who they're with. And 8 out of 10 say that religion is an important or moderately important to them.
Listen, Art, when are you coming to New York?
Probably in a couple of weeks.
Would you come on our show? We want you to be on the show. It's important. We have statistics that at least 1 million people every month are involved in. I don't know what they are, but they're alarming. If one is involved, it's too much.
Listen, I lecture.
I know you do.
And travel all over the country. In fact, I'll be in Chattanooga tonight speaking for Teen Challenge on the subject.
Come up here, will you? We're at WCBS in New York.
Love to be on your
Give my
show.
best to Jack. I went to Emerson Junior High School with your son, Jack Linkletter.
Good for you, Stan.
All right. Thanks very much. All right, Dr. Leary, look, we've sandbagged you to some extent. You are not written. Are you all right?
Am I all right?
Yes. How many LSD trips have you taken?
Well, it's like how many times have we made love? You know?
Well, they say you've taken 600 LSD trips.
Maybe.
Does that sound about right?
Could be.
Do you think you've lost any of your brain power? I'm seriously, do you think you've suffered any brain damage as a result of that?
Yeah, I think I'm one of the smartest people on the planet today. I'm writing 2 or 3 books a year.
Right.
I'm giving lectures. I'm very well received.
You're also being arrested,
I
aren't you?
That I must be stupid. I must be brain damaged to get sandbagged this way.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, but...
Were you sandbagged, for example, on August 30th, 1979? Here's the Los Angeles Times.
Yeah.
Can you see this? Leary and wife arrested on drug charge.
Uh-huh.
And there was the couple's 5-year-old son, who had been sleeping, was placed in the care of a family friend. Your son was there when you were arrested.
Yeah.
What were you taking?
But you didn't follow up
Go
on
ahead.
that there were no illegal drugs whatsoever.
But you were
There was
taking
no
drugs,
crime.
weren't you?
There was no, absolutely, we were making love in our bedroom when the police came through the window.
What kind of drugs were you taking, though?
Legal drugs.
What kind of drugs?
Yeah. Legal drugs.
What does that mean?
Drugs you get from a prescription.
Tell us one. Look on the camera. Tell us, what was the drug?
Are we on the camera now?
Yes,
or?
sir. Just focus on this camera.
See, here's the situation.
Go ahead.
Number one, this was a setup. The police came into our bedroom. Mm-hmm. There were no illegal drugs there. Before this happened, I'd been on television saying that we don't take any illegal drugs to feel better or to increase our intelligence or to, become better lovers, but we do take legal drugs. Now, on the basis of this statement, we take legal drugs, the police busted in and arrested us. So now in public, I say we don't take any illegal drugs to feel better or to get smarter.
Why would you need it 59
or we don't
years of
take
age?
any
Tim, why would
drugs.
you need drugs anymore?
Well, that's none of your business.
No, it is my
business. There happen to be 60 million people in this country who like to smoke marijuana, and it's none of your business or the business of the government to be
Doesn't
harassing
society
us.
have the right to protect itself against people like you or against drug takers? Seriously.
Go back to Iran. You're an ayatollah. What do you want to do? Cut the heads off people who drink beer because you don't want to?
All right.
You have absolutely no right interfering in the business of what goes on with 45 million
You're a
people
real
who
example of
smoke marijuana.
open-mindedness in this country. It's brought us, it's been a mixed bag, hasn't it?
I think that maybe 1 hour a year, someone like me comes along and challenges the Judeo-Christian ethic. My main function is to reduce guilt to reduce fear, and to encourage people to thumb your nose at authority.
That's right.
Now, 1 hour a year I do this, and am I sandbagged and you're set up and you got art link? You can't let my voice go out for half an hour.
Excuse me, Doctor.
Okay, well, that wraps up today's stream, everyone. So let me get to the super chats. Again, please smash that like if you guys have not. I hope you enjoyed today's stream. It hopefully was a thorough analysis and overview of the life and work of the 1960s psychedelic guru, Dr. Timothy Leary. And so first super chat is right here with Stevie. And Stevie donates $5 and he just says super chat. Well, thank you so much, Stevie. I greatly appreciate your support, brother. Thank you very, very much. And Thomas Henderson with the next super chat. Let me hit that and re-show it. Thomas Henderson with the next super chat. And sorry, it was Thomas Henderson with the great comment. Tell us how you really feel, Mr. Linkletter. So Thomas Henderson says, another great stream. Well, thank you very much, Thomas. I truly appreciate it. He said, tune in and drop out did have far-reaching consequences with connections to the deep state. Always learn something new in your presentations. Keep up the good work, my brother in Christ. Well, thank you so much, Thomas Henderson. Again, I'm glad that you enjoyed today's stream, that it was insightful, that you gleaned something from it. And thank you very, very much. So thank you everybody who has been supporting the stream. Again, if you would like to check out the second half of today's stream, you can do that over at the website with this link right here and go ahead and register. So please click that link and you can become a website member and watch the second half of this stream. Also, if you would like to set up a potential one-on-one session to talk about anything you would be interested in, you can do so with this link right here. Truthseeker1961 says, that's a myth. Virtually impossible to kill brain cells. They regenerate. Body's a wonderful thing. Not endorsing drugs, of course, but back then they thought that there was no real science backing it up. Well, I've heard that there's certainly different arguments about the neuroplasticity of the brain. So if you're going to talk about some of the more recent research, how the neuroplasticity can be challenged through repeated drug use. So maybe there is regenerative capabilities of neurons that we aren't born with a certain amount and that's all we get. But the repeated use of drug abuse actually changes the neuroplasticity of the brain. There's theories that I've heard that the more you engage with particular drugs, the harder it is to eventually break from those and live a sort of sober life without the sort of Pavlovian response back to using them, which is always a temptation for me. So again, I've been very open about the cannabis and stuff like that. But yeah, so Theoria Zone says, see, he nailed it. I'm here to help you deny Jesus Christ. Yeah, exactly. Well, he's very open about his hostility. Leary was very open about his hostility towards Christianity. And if you look at his life, a lot of people believe it was because of his upbringing and that his mother and I think it was his aunt, were very devout Irish Catholics. And Timothy, being a bit of a troublemaker, didn't get along very well with some of the Catholic nuns and his Catholic school upbringing. So it seemed like, and also his dad wasn't there, right? So we did a whole stream on daddy issues before. I streamed about daddy issues and how important the father in the nuclear home is for a man to relate back to the paternal Christian Trinity. And so I think there's a lot of things. And then, you know, most people don't talk about the fact that his first wife committed suicide, right? I mean, Mary Ann committed suicide after she had 2 kids with Tim because he fell in love with a young woman. So I feel like if that happened to me, that would be so hard to get over and live down. That is certainly a tough one. But yeah, Timothy Leary, he got wrecked because he is a I wouldn't be surprised if he was. But he was definitely working with the CIA. That's for sure. So, that's for sure. So anyways, guys, I'm going to hop off here. Thank you all for the support. Thank you very much to Thomas Henderson and Stevie. I will be back probably Sunday, maybe Sunday for the 4th of July. So anyways, I will hop off here. Thank you all. And I'll check you again, probably Sunday or Monday. I'll be back. So thank you everyone for the support. I will see you next time. And as always, God bless.